Well, here we go quickly became here we go again for Steelers fans tonight at Heinz Field. Not many in attendance, obviously, at Heinz Field, but oh, so many across the ubiquitous Steelers nation following on TV across the nation, around the world, and they were duly disappointed. No head coach, no starting guard, and a house of absolute disgrace and disarray for the Browns over the years. But Cleveland, yes, the Browns are advancing in the playoffs. They score 48 points, beating the Steelers 48-37. It's the most points ever allowed by the Steelers in a playoff game, and it's, perpetrated against them by the Browns at Heinz Field. It's incredible. I didn't see it coming. I'm pretty sure Mike Asti didn't see it coming. I'm Matt Gajtka, by the way. This is Pittsburgh Postgame, our final Pittsburgh Steelers edition for the season as we turn the calendar page into January. Last week, yeah, they lose to Cleveland, but it was close, and the Steelers just played their scrubs, right? But as it turned out, maybe they lost a lot in that bye week. It certainly looked like it, and the Browns had everything to play for, as did the Steelers, but the Browns played like they had everything to play for, and from snap one, literally, Mike, snap one of this game, it almost all went Cleveland's way. A lot of garbage time points and yards for the Steelers and Ben Roethlisberger and a couple of receivers. And yeah, it got dramatic somewhat in the second half. A couple of preposterous punts, which we'll talk about, took some of the air out of the attempted comeback by the Steelers. But overall, from the moment this game started, it was a Browns kind of night. And when was the last time we could say that?
To say the very least, it was a Browns kind of night and then some. To the victor go the spoils, and I guess I'll say this too, the Cleveland Browns fans are among the most loyal fans in all of sports.
Yes,
They've endured maybe more than any other fan base in all of sports, and certainly the Bills' success, Bills fans I'm sure are going to yell at me, but they at least experienced 4 straight conference title victories in most of their lifetimes. The Browns never even appearing in a Super Bowl, and they showed the graphic, all the success prior to the merger for the Browns, none for the Steelers. After the merger, the Cleveland Browns franchise has just been lowly to say the least. And while LeBron James broke the Cleveland citywide sports curse, winning the Cavs a title in 2016, which was the first for the city since the Browns championship with Jim Brown in 1964, the Cleveland Browns football team has still been in the midst of 18 years without a playoff appearance until this year. They get there with that aforementioned Week 17 win over the Steelers that we talked about. If the Steelers, I even said it, if the Steelers were at full strength, I thought that if the Steelers played close to how they played in the second half against Indianapolis, if even their defense played a little bit better and the defense was at full strength, the Steelers would have won that game. They almost came back and won that game with Mason Rudolph and eliminated the Browns from contention before even the playoffs would start. But nonetheless, the Browns get the victory, and the Browns basically won this game almost right after the opening kickoff. First play was right. It was the worst possible way for the Steelers to start a playoff game unless you have literally Bane destroying Heinz Field all over again, like in the Dark Knight and the Batman series films. That actually, someone even said this to me on Twitter, Matt, that wasn't as bad as the start of this game because Heinz Ward at least scored a touchdown prior to that. This Steelers team allowed just the worst case scenario to occur. And even when they turned it on towards the end and Ben had that second half heroics that he's had somewhat most of the second half of this year, everyone knew it was too little too late at that point. They weren't really coaching as if they were trying to come back in this game. It was kind of a weird mixed bag of a comedy of errors with horrible decisions. When you're down 28-0 against any team at any level, certainly a playoff team, you're in trouble and very likely going to lose. But they almost made it a game. They did end up losing. And despite the 11-0 start and how they weren't really as good as that record with how they were playing poorly at times, despite the second half of the season and kind of puttering it away and limping into the 3 seed with a division title, this is still a very talented Steeler team, a Steeler team with mostly veterans, and we'll get to this later in terms of the future of this team, but veterans who were telling me on Zoom all week, we got to at least get this one. We got to get the job done. This is the year to culminate 4 or 5 years. We have to at least get this. It will be embarrassing if we don't. And well, they didn't. They didn't show up. And the 2 veterans that have been talking the most, the 2 veterans that contracts have been Well, it seems like they're going to be back, but maybe they shouldn't be back based on their play. And the two veterans that played the worst from the start of this game to now, Ben Roethlisberger, despite all the yards and TDs, certainly was a poor effort from him. And Maurkice Pouncey, who was getting the credit for that first touchdown in favor of the Browns. They're sitting there on the bench. Ed Thompson told us they're sitting there on the bench, both of them apparently crying their eyes out at the end of the game. Maybe they realized this was it, because whatever decisions they both made that they wanted to come back, maybe they realized that wouldn't be the best interest of the team for them to do so. So we'll see. This offseason is going to be a long one. This offseason is going to be a bad one. And a Steeler franchise that I know firsthand from just getting texts from members of the PR and comm staff every time I do a show and they don't like it in my coverage of the past and my appearances on shows. And they thought that myself and others try to be negative too much. Well, we're dealing with what the body of work that's put in front of us. And this is a Steeler franchise that does not like being criticized, but they are going to hear venom for 365 days now. And I will say, lastly here, as we segue into this broadcast, Mike Tomlin's a Hall of Fame coach. This game does not take that away. He's certainly going to be in Canton someday. It's a guarantee for me. His resume calls for it. He's a Hall of Famer. Ben Roethlisberger, Hall of Fame quarterback. His resume says that. You look at the body work. You look at who's in Canton. He's going to be there someday. This game won't take away from that. They're going to have those days, and this game won't be discussed, and you're going to see tons of heroics from the two of them. But this is still a black eye. This is still a stain. This is still a game that is unacceptable for the two of them based on their careers, and even this year, and shouldn't have happened. It's one thing to lose to a good Browns team that also has dealt with a roller coaster ride, but not a Browns team that's dealt with COVID so much this week that the head coach is actually watching on the couch with the two of us. And to lose this way where you're out of it almost immediately with tons of mistakes. So it was bad. It was embarrassing. It's going to be a long off season. Tons of change is needed. And I think many thought this team was no longer going to be a championship contender with how this season kind of unfolded. Many realized they weren't going to win a title this year, but I think most thought they would at least get this victory. And if they didn't, they wouldn't lose this way, but they lost, and it was really, really embarrassing.
I have a lot of not so fun facts piled up for you on this one, as you might imagine. Again, the final score, it almost beggars belief. It does beggar belief for me. Browns 48, Steelers 37. Yeah, it was me last week who said the Steelers will beat the Browns comfortably covering the spread, which, you know what, Mike, was pretty stubborn this week. I noticed that our friends out in Las Vegas and other places, they weren't giving the Steelers a ton of credit for that comeback against the Colts, for, well, we talked about their 11-0 record, that luster faded quite quickly toward the end of the season. But still, with Cleveland coming in, with really the Browns not playing terrific down the stretch, they had to beat a intentionally depleted Steelers team to even make the playoffs in Week 17. But it was only a 6-point spread-ish, somewhere around there. So it didn't make me nervous, but it made me think, what do they know that I don't know? Turns out they might have known a lot, but regardless, the Steelers were favored to win this game. They should have won this game, but they lost this game in the first quarter. They're down 28-0. I see some chatter in our live chat. By the way, yeah, feel free to vent, to commiserate right there next to the screen. I see Ryan Golombiewski, a nice Polish name like mine, saying that the Steelers' stats were by far so much better than the Browns. Well, they were, because the Steelers had to open it up. Ben threw, almost 70 times in this game, and he completed 47, 501 yards, 4 touchdowns, but 4 picks, including a couple in the first half. A killer pick, Mike.
Yeah.
After the initial Browns scoring play, when they recovered the terrible Maurkice Pouncey snap in the end zone, Ben tries to force something over the middle of Benny Snell. It's 2 feet over his head. That's intercepted. The Browns go in from there. So, yeah, Ben did not play anywhere near his best, despite some gaudy numbers in the end. That's why you just can't look at the box score. It's about game theory. And the Browns were playing prevent for about 2.5 hours there.
They almost prevented themselves from winning at one point.
Maybe a little too much. Yeah, I think there were a couple of drives there near the end where they got a stop or two, and I felt like they actually snapped out of it for a bit and said, okay, we got to put a little bit of pressure on the line of scrimmage here, because the Steelers are getting some big chunks. But neither here nor there. Yeah, Baker Mayfield didn't play amazing. I thought he was kind of looking nervous and erratic all night, but he ends up throwing for 3 touchdowns, some catch and runs there. Nick Chubb was excellent. The Browns' offensive line was killer. They were blocking the heck out of the Steelers' defensive front. Jarvis Landry, a long touchdown in the first quarter. Nick Chubb got one on the receiving end as well, a 40-yarder that essentially put it away in the fourth. The Browns had 35 points, Mike, in the first half. Here's another one of those facts that I was able to dig up. That's the most points scored by an NFL playoff team ever in the first half. So for me, I think it does come down to, mistakes on the offensive side, but the Steelers defense, I know they're depleted. They lost Highsmith during the game. They did not have Joe Hayden due to COVID. So bad break there, definitely. And they're missing Bush. They're missing Bud Dupree, clearly. But they got no hits, no sacks on Mayfield. And for the second consecutive playoff game, they allow 45-plus points. This is the most points actually ever allowed by the Steelers, which I mentioned at the top of the show. So I have a hard time really pinning down. Is it mistakes on offense? Is it the defense not really getting any stops of consequence, maybe one or two? Boy, there's so much blame out there, and we can really spread it evenly, can't we?
Yeah. Number one, though, as the PD here, we're going to need to try to keep it clean there in the chat because I can't. We have our advisory up pretty high, but I'm having to go through this. So I can ban you if you keep on swearing through the chat here. But aside from that, it was bad. Again, it was embarrassing. And honestly, I put this poll question up on Twitter, Matt, and I think I have the answer for you in terms of if this was the most embarrassing loss in Steelers playoff history. And really, this boils down to, was it more embarrassing than the loss against the Jacksonville Jaguars, also at Heinz Field a few years ago, that being in the divisional round? They didn't win a playoff game that year because that was, I believe, a season they got a bye. But it was horrible. Blake Bortles marched up and down the field. The Steelers defense collapsed again in that game. The offense did score points. It wasn't this much of a game in terms of disparity because they weren't ever trailing this much, but they played really, really poorly in that game. I was actually at Heinz Field covering that game for another outlet. And this game's more embarrassing to me. Number one, you start 11-0 at one point in this year. Again, I get it. You weren't playing as well to your record, but when you're 11-0, you got to at least win one playoff game at minimum, just based on where you are seed-wise. Number two, everything the Browns dealt with this week, you're forgetting not only the fact that they had all these players out, they literally have not practiced in 2 weeks. I mean, honestly, I hate giving teams excuses, but I'll tell you what, if the Steelers would have came back and won this game, Browns fans would have been able to say, well, we had half the roster out and we didn't practice for 2 weeks, and it wouldn't be that ridiculous because that was the case for the Browns. You could argue this game should have been moved just on that alone, based on the game being moved against the Ravens with some competitive advantage being part of that decision. So the Browns are kind of getting screwed by even playing this game, let alone being certainly not the favorite and on the road. Their coaches drove to Pittsburgh because they didn't want to have any further COVID spread. You're seeing 6 cars in basically what they thought was a funeral procession coming to Pittsburgh on the highway. And yet the Steelers managed to be the ones getting buried, and they get buried very early in this game. And again, it's not to the fact that they lost to the Browns, which I will tell you, if they would have lost to the Browns, it still would have been a really, really bad loss. And I certainly didn't see it coming. But the way the Steelers had been playing recently, that wouldn't be shell-shocking. The shell-shocking part is the way they lost this game, the fact they never were really in this game. And you bring up Ben's numbers. This game is going to be, for me, an example of why, as much as I'm a stats guy, and I know you are too, the stats cannot always tell the story, and why when you're evaluating a quarterback's performance, you cannot just simply go to yards and touchdowns as like many used to do. And I know that when we do an all-time quarterback ranking, it's usually the guy who threw the most yards and touchdowns. And certainly that's the careers of many of the greats. But that's not the entire story. Ben threw for over 500 yards in this game. He threw for 4 touchdowns in this game. Matt, I don't know if you saw this on Steelers Now yet, but he broke a postseason record for completions in a single playoff game in this game, and broke a record for overall attempts in this game. And it's ironic if it's his last game as a Steelers starter, because earlier in the season, he literally said, if it's up to me, we'd throw 70 times. Well, maybe his last Steelers moment, he throws for 68 times, and it is a horrible decision because they lose, but they're really forced into it because of how the game unfolded early. But also, I think another point that's going to probably be lost this week, certainly with the Steelers covered, because that's going to all be about how the Steelers have played so poorly in the offseason and that unfolding. But even from the Browns fans, they're going to celebrate this win as they certainly deserve. but Baker Mayfield didn't have an amazing day. I actually talked about this with one of my friends and colleagues, John Rutter, down there, who's with the Fan in WEWS in Cleveland in our preview show, that Baker Mayfield's overall season stats very similar to Ben. Ben criticized by being a veteran, Baker Mayfield beloved. Very similar seasons. Baker has not played well for several weeks in a row, going to the Jets game, to the Steelers week 17, to even this game where he played certainly better. But it's not like he's dominating. I don't want to take this away from the Browns by any means, because they certainly deserve to win this game, and they put more effort in and certainly cared more, certainly had the passion. But it can certainly be argued the Steelers lost this game just as much as the Browns won it. When you bungle the snap to open up the game, basically with a veteran borderline Hall of Fame offensive lineman who's the only one that's been a constant most of the year, then Ben throws every errant interception you could ask for. Several of those end up being points for Cleveland. Field position was all Browns. The Steelers had the stats and had the yards, but it just doesn't matter when you allow that field position and you make all those turnovers, and they certainly helped the Browns win this. And just as Mike T said at halftime, we have no chance if we don't stop turning over the damn ball. It's an age-old adage, but it's really, really true. The NFL is the most even league really of any professional league in terms of anyone can win any given day, any given game day. And it certainly is the case when you allow the opponent 4 extra cracks at it and you turn it over 4 times. So the Browns get the victory. They deserve it, but the Steelers certainly helped them out. It was a really bad day. And honestly, and I'm not just saying this because I know the Steelers' history is very, very long and mostly rich. It's the most embarrassing loss in Steelers postseason history, which is incredible to say if that is the last moment of the Ben Roethlisberger era or the Mike Tomlin era, or certainly of them together. I don't believe Tomlin to be fired, but it's a bad moment nonetheless.
He's Mike Asti. I'm Matt Gajtka. This is Pittsburgh Postgame on Pittsburgh Sports Live. We're going to be hanging with you well past midnight. In fact, we are past midnight by a couple of minutes here, 12:03 Eastern time. We're still absorbing what we saw there on the field at Heinz. And I suppose, luckily for Steelers fans, none of them, at least if you weren't related to or a friend of a player, you weren't allowed to be in the building tonight. And that might be the only positive that we have tonight. Also, Chris Boswell was back and made a couple of field goals. So
yeah, has never missed still in his postseason career.
And Derek Watt got a couple of mysterious carries in the first half, too. So good for him and the at least one half of the Watt brothers on the Steelers, because TJ was seen nowhere near Baker Mayfield tonight. Mike, here's what it boils down to me, and here's why I'm in favor of big changes for the Steelers this offseason. I realize Mike Tomlin has, the 5th or 4th best winning percentage in the regular season in NFL history. I realize Ben Roethlisberger, like you said at the top, he's a Hall of Famer and first ballot, and should be ushered right in with a gold jacket and cannon as soon as he hangs them up. But despite his 2 Super Bowls, despite he and Mike Tomlin teaming up for the Super Bowl after the 2008 season, despite the team doing a good job overhauling the defense mid-stride here in this decade, maybe it didn't quite line up with the height of the Killer Bees, Ben Bell, of course, and Antonio Brown. But at the same time, this team has had a lot of talent on both sides of the ball, intermittently, but there's been a lot of talent there, and they've made the playoffs more often than not. But in the playoffs, something just goes awry. And I think you can point to the decision to punt a couple of times in these games. There's not the execution from the coaching perspective and the player perspective in the playoffs. Since the Super Bowl loss to Green Bay after the 2010 season, went back and looked it up. That's now 3-7 in the postseason for the Steelers. Only 1, 2, 3 of those 7 losses were even close in the end. The Jacksonville loss, that was kind of fake close, like this one. I didn't count that one. A couple of one-possession losses to the Broncos, and also a defeat. Let me look that one up. I just had it too. There was another close-ish one in there as well. Oh, it was the Packers in the Super Bowl. That was just 6 points. But other than that, the defense has really let the Steelers down. They have allowed an average of 35 points in those 7 postseason losses over the past decade. So, like I said, I know they had to revamp the defense, and I know that Ben and the offense has made its share of errors, and they've given the ball away, and it's been some short fields. It was personified tonight in the first half. But it's kind of ironic with the reputation this franchise has that defense has been the weaker side of things, at least this decade, when it comes to the playoff futility. I'll say it, 3-7, that's playoff futility.
Look, again, Tomlin and Ben's career and their resumes and their overall body of work, it shouldn't be disrespected. It shouldn't not be appreciated by Steeler fans. They're both Hall of Famers to me, and Ben's definitely getting there. And if you look at Tony Dungy and Bill Cowher and several other coaches that have got in recently, it would be hard-pressed to argue against Mike Tomlin in terms of his overall resume. Granted, when you look at the overall body of work, it might be a little misleading, as you're alluding to, because a lot of that success overall was early in his career. And unfortunately, this is something that's now going to be said about Mike Tomlin if he doesn't at least get another postseason win as Steelers head coach. He won early as Steelers head coach with a lot of players that were left over from Bill Cowher. Once it became him to be the CEO of sorts, it's been a lot of postseason disappointments. Again, Tomlin's going to get to the Hall of Fame, but that doesn't look good for him overall in terms of public perception, whether it's fair or not. And yes, it's absolutely been a defensive issue. Again, as much as Todd Haley was a scapegoat for that postseason loss to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and so much so that a fan attacked him outside Tequila Cowboy. I mean, it was ridiculous with the offense taking the blame. And when you have Hall of Famers like Ben and AB and Le'Veon Bell was certainly an all-pro at that point, and you don't get that victory against a team that many thought wasn't nearly as explosive on the road, and fans were certainly a factor there. That's really, really bad and was certainly the most embarrassing loss in Steelers postseason history at that point. But that game was lost because of the defense. The defense collapsed. And as I've said on several other postgame shows, Matt, and even on my show, as cool as it is for the Steelers defensive unit to have the sack record, and I get overall sack numbers and pass rush is more deflated now than before because there's so many more pass attempts, they're still sacking the quarterback more than any other team, significantly more than any other team. And when you usually get pressure and create turnovers, usually that leads to victories in the NFL. So they've been doing it better than anybody else the last 4 or 5 years with a certain cast of characters that have been mostly consistent with Cam Hayward and Bud Dupree and TJ Watt, but certainly some different guys in there as well. And while that's really, really impressive, you compare it to other great defensive units over the history of the NFL, certainly even the Buccaneers of the late 90s and early 2000s, the team they beat the record of. That's 3 NFC title appearances. That's a Super Bowl championship to cap that off, to go in the sunset for the Buccaneers. The Steeler team is looking at multiple postseason losses that could be argued as the most embarrassing in the history of the franchise, both responsible because of the defense during that streak. Both of those years are in the midst of that streak. And the other 2 years, Matt, they didn't make the playoffs. So I get it's not totally their fault. Ben hurt last year, etc. The offense certainly didn't perform at times this year. And I get the defense was asked to do a lot this year. I get they were depleted at times and injured. But do you think Browns fans want to hear that? Do you think if a Browns fan tuned in or in the chat, they're probably laughing at me saying it because they had half their defense out because of COVID. They had no offensive line. Their head coach literally was not permitted to have any type of microphone communication with anybody there at Heinz. I don't even get that rule. He's at home, not allowed to be there. It was actually a rule. My fiance asked me, well, couldn't he just coach it from his couch? And I had to explain he's actually not allowed. He is not allowed to text anyone, to call anyone, to have a halftime speech. He's not involved. Ridiculous, but nonetheless, that's the case. So they've dealt with tons too. Everyone's dealt with tons. And the Steelers' excuses and everything that will not be said about this team, it just they didn't get the job done. So I don't know if I'm going to go as far as they need to rebuild everything because there's still tons of talent there. They will be forced to do a lot of these changes, Matt, because the contract situation for the Steelers and the cap situation coming into next year is bad. And with COVID and the NFL trying to help these teams because they couldn't have fan revenue, rumors are, and it's borderline true, they're going to bring the cap down. So that means that when you have Juju looking for a deal and certainly wants money in addition to Love in Pittsburgh, James Conner wants a new deal. He's probably not going to be offered one, but there are many players that could be offered a new deal. Bud Dupree, who's been injured, certainly up for a contract and could probably cash in if he's healthy with how he played before. They're going to look very different. Many of these players are going to be gone. I would imagine everyone I named is no longer a Steeler next year because they either think they can replace the talent with somebody else through the draft, like a receiver, or they just haven't been good enough, like James Conner, for what he may want money-wise. So they're going to look different. They're going to have changes. Ben had said a few weeks ago that he wants to come back next year and he would not want to end on a poor note. He also said he wanted multiple Lombardis. That's probably not happening. It'll be interesting if he just chooses to be done on this bad note, because that's always what he said he did not want to do. It also will be interesting if the Steelers sit him down and say, look, we wanted to do what you wanted to do. You certainly were playing well enough at times, even when you weren't elite. Now you're playing to a level that actually is hurting us. I get you don't want to end on a bad note, but Brett Favre, John Elway, Tom Brady playing today, Joe Montana, the list goes on, Peyton Manning, they had to end their career elsewhere. We will celebrate you. We will go to Canton. We'll give you the jacket. We'll freaking throw videos up every 20 minutes on Twitter, but you're going to have to end this elsewhere if you want to keep playing, because we need to eventually move on and rebuild this thing, whether we believe or not in Mason Rudolph. It has to be over in terms of the Ben era. So that might be a conversation that him and Tomlin or the Rooneys have in this offseason. Tomlin, though, the Steelers don't fire coaches. They're not going to fire a championship coach who won a division. It just won't happen. I get that he's underachieved. It just won't happen. But I think it is time the Ben era ends, and it might be whether he likes it or not.
See, I know what you're saying in terms of realistic expectations, but for me, I would rather bring Ben Roethlisberger back for one more year at $41 million cap hit. I know that's hefty, but right. I would rather bring Ben Roethlisberger back than Mike Tomlin or either coordinator. I just think there has to be some changes. I didn't like
one of
the offense became so predictable at the end of the year. And defensively, like I said, the defense, I think, underperforms its talent level. And we talk about the sacks and that record. And hey, great for the Steelers there, but where is it in these nitty-gritty playoff matchups? Last two times that defense has gone out there, especially this time around, it had been playing for the most part pretty consistently, and then you get completely curb stomped here in the playoffs against a team in the Browns that isn't exactly a multifaceted offense. Yeah, Baker Mayfield's all right, but he's not going to slice and dice you. The touchdowns he threw were catch and runs set up by the run. They have a great run game. They have a good offensive line. Do the Browns, even missing a starting guard. So it wasn't some huge matchup problem for the Steelers defense. They just got outplayed. You got Robert Spillane getting juked out of his cleats by Jarvis Landry on one particular embarrassing play there in the second half that helped the Browns put it away. So I think Keith Butler, Randy Fichtner, maybe you don't fire Tomlin, but I think you turn that offensive and defensive coordinator, those positions over. Because it's going to be, let's be honest too about Ben as well. It's going to be tough. I think number one for him to go out on a note like this. I know we don't always get to choose when we go out, but when we have a huge salary cap hit the following year, we do have some power over when we leave. So I think it's going to be more difficult for the Steelers to move on from Ben Roethlisberger, just logistically, than it may seem right now. So if I were a betting man, I think he would be back, but I think we do see some big coaching changes, if not necessarily Mike Tomlin, and like you alluded to, and like Schnoa on our live chat is talking about Pouncey, Villanueva, Filer, Connor, Dupree, Juju, McDonald,
Villanueva's gone.
Vince Williams. Yeah, they're all likely gone. So there's going to be some personnel changes too here. So there will be alterations. I would be okay with giving Ben one last shot over rolling over the same scheme on both sides of the ball. That's what I'm trying to say.
There's going to be changes with the Pittsburgh Steelers, whether the Steelers like it or not. That was actually, Matt, to be fair to this conversation, there were going to be changes with the Steelers via the players, even if they won the Super Bowl. There was no way they were going to bring even half of these guys back, because certainly if they kept on winning and playing well, they're going to want too much money. And I do think it's a real thing, as much as some don't like to hear it. The Steelers and Kevin Colbert do believe the receivers grow on trees in the draft. They're not going to pay big money to a wide receiver because they can continuously draft receivers. You saw what Claypool this year, and the list of great receiver rookie seasons in NFL history, half of them are by the Pittsburgh Steelers, drafted by Kevin Colbert. So the Steelers certainly are not paying tons of money to Juju. If he wants back, it'll be on a hometown discount. James Conner is not a feature back. If he wants back, it's going to be on a hometown discount as a complimentary piece. Bud's gone. Villanueva is no longer good enough. Marquise Pouncey, despite making a Pro Bowl this year, so I will tell you, his agent will argue he needs money because he did make a Pro Bowl this year. But as you know, Derek Jeter made an All-Star game his last season too, and he no longer really deserved it. The name gets you that honor sometimes. That's the case with Pouncey. I also will tell you that some of those players, Villanueva in particular, many of the veterans have been kind of not fans of him for years now. based on him going rogue against the team on many different issues that they feel passionate about. And now that he no longer is flat out good, I'm sure they're not going to be rushing to bring the Brinks truck out there for Villanueva. So many are gone, and that's just the case. I'm sure one of the coordinators will end up getting the axe and will get the blame. But honestly, Matt, and this might be, negative here, but we agree Tomlin's not going to be fired regardless of what maybe somebody wants. That's just not what the Steelers do when you're still winning and getting to that point. Ben's cap hit will probably bring him back, although I will tell you, while you don't want to have him end on that note, and players of that caliber usually don't end on that note, even though nobody gets their way, multiple Hall of Fame quarterbacks, last pass they threw in the league and for a franchise was an interception. Favre with the Packers, last pass, NFC title game, 2007, interception. We knew the whole drama after that. He wasn't back. They kind of pushed him out, as well as him wanting to retire and then waffling. And Tom Brady's last pass with the Patriots last year, interception in the playoffs. They lose the wild card round. Now, granted, that again is more his choice, but rumors say the Patriots also, with Belichick, wanted to start rebuilding and be away from him. So eventually, regardless of having a poor moment and wanting a better moment, you just got to be done. So maybe they eat the cap hit. We don't know. Maybe Ben, with his sitting on that bench and the image they had Thompson shot and crying his eyes out with Pouncey and him talking, and they are very, very close. They've been there very, very long on this team. Maybe Ben will say, and he's in his Zoom now as we speak, that, you know what? I'm hurting the team by doing this. So maybe I'm going to leave. He has nothing else to prove in terms of getting in the Hall of Fame. He's going to be there. So if he goes out there next year and just sucks, maybe that's not better for him. So maybe he is now convinced and surprised on how poorly he's played that this is it too. We don't know. We'll get tons of these questions answered throughout the offseason, and several other shows will happen. But instant reaction now, there are going to be changes. One of the coordinators will probably go. But really, is firing one of these coordinators and losing some of the veterans that you knew you were going to lose anyway, that weren't really great players for you anymore anyway, is that really going to help things that much? Replacing Villanueva, Pouncey, Connor, and Juju, and firing Fickner and Butler, or one of the two, and then replacing them with whoever else, does that really make your team better next year? It almost guarantees they're taking a dip next year based on what we're looking at, unless something catastrophic happens with a trade or something that I just don't see.
Well, I still think the defense has enough young players who are under club control that they can reasonably be expected to perform at a level pretty close to this one, maybe even better. Who knows? With maybe a more appropriate scheme, or maybe a better type of game plan in some of these bigger games of the season. So that's what it comes down to me for me as well is situational coaching. And that's my jumping off point to get to the two preposterous punts, to borrow a phrase from the old ESPN.com columnist. What was his name? Greg Easterbrook. He used to talk about punts. Wow. He was ahead of his time because now I think via analytics and data, we now realize that football teams punt way too often. And I always loved that high school coach in Louisiana who never punts basically, except when he's inside his own 10-yard line. That guy's my personal hero because not only do the numbers bear out that more often than not it pays to be aggressive on fourth down, but also I think it's a boost to your team. You show confidence in both the offense and the defense when you do go for it on fourth down. Often it's disguised as trusting your defense, quote unquote, when you punt it. But really, wouldn't trusting your defense be, I don't care if I turn it over here on downs because my D is going to back me up. So in a lot of ways, I think what we saw tonight was a pretty good description of the two terrible kinds of punts that NFL coaches can do. One is just on fourth and short in general. The 4th and 1 punt in the fourth quarter, Steelers down 12. They just scored on their past 2 possessions. They're looking pretty good. The Browns aren't playing great defense at that point. I don't know if they played great defense all night outside of the interceptions. And some of those were thrown right to them. Yeah. So for me, you go for it there. That one's an easier call. Near midfield, 4th and 1, you're down 12. It's a playoff game. Come on. But even the 4th and 8 or whatever it was in the first half, down 28-0 at the Browns 38. Hell, at least kick a field goal. Try to get some points on the board. You're down 28 points and you're punting the ball away 12 yards on the other side of the 50. That one almost made me turn the TV off, to be honest with you, because I'm like, if Tomlin's quitting, if the Steelers are quitting, tactically speaking, then why am I hanging in there with them? Now, I'm glad I didn't because it was a pretty entertaining game in the end with the attempted comeback. But for me, that just encapsulates some of these playoff failures in these key spots. They're not coming through with the right decisions, whether it be coaches or players. I don't know how you fix that necessarily, but I do know it's a reflection on the man at the top, and that man's name is Mike Tomlin.
Mike Tomlin always says, he's been saying it the entire time he's been in the Pittsburgh Steelers.
I know what you're going to say, but go ahead.
He's been saying it the entire time that no matter what happens, no matter what he does, no matter what, he will not live in his fears. However, Mike Tomlin has consistently lived in his fears more and more as he's got older and the years piled up as him being Steelers head coach. He has lived in his fears more than ever before this year, and he lived in his fears more than any other game that I've seen in this game against the Cleveland Browns, which is the most embarrassing loss for him and the Steelers franchise in their loss to the Browns. And I don't care about whatever happened the rest of this game. I get they were down 28-0. I get that was bad with turnovers. I get Ben wasn't playing well. I get Pouncey sucked. I get everything about the defense. Those two moments certainly helped lead this team to this loss. Number one, I don't care what's going on. I don't care if you're the championship contender. I don't care if you're the underdog. I don't care what's going on with the global pandemic or whether you live in your fears or whether you've won a ring in the past or you have not. I don't care the pressure. If you are down 28-0 in a playoff game at any point, I'm not punting the football. If the score is 28-0 and I have the 0, I am basically going to, because Matt, here's the thing. What's the worst thing that could happen there? Oh no, I'm down 35-0. What the hell is the difference? I'm going to lose by a lot of points. Matt Gajtka and Mike Asti are going to go on the postgame show and say you lost, you sucked, you're embarrassing. Whether it's 28-0, 35-0, 42-0, doesn't matter. And we're not fooled by this comeback. It still sucked. And when you go to the second half and you mount your comeback, because as much as I will tell you, and both of us have called tons of games too, people were mad on Twitter. I get that Chris Collinsworth was really trying to drag this game to be entertaining. And I do get that he said 17 times, oh, you got to watch out for the Steelers comeback and about momentum. He didn't want you to turn off the TV. He was trying to keep you there.
Exactly.
So that's why he did that. And I'm sure that he was laughing to himself at some point. But at one point, he wasn't lying. He was telling the truth in the second half, because I am sure, Matt, if you also noticed on Twitter, normally when you have a game in which the rival underdog is winning by that much, you see fans bragging and it's getting really ugly on Twitter. And I'm not saying no Browns fans were, but a lot of Browns fans, even in my mentions, even in private DMs, were basically telling me it's the Browns. I'm not saying anything. I'm not locking this up. This is the Browns. We saw the stats that were put up there, the 32 points with the Frank Wright game for the Bills, the greatest comeback ever. If the Steelers would have come back 28 down, it would have tied for the second most. I even had people tweeting me saying, it's Cleveland. This would be fitting. This is how we're going to lose our first playoff game in 18 years. It's going to happen. Remember, the Steelers came back after being down by a lot, not 28, but a lot, 24-7 back in January of 2003. So they've experienced it before. They've had the drive. They've had the fumble. They know this is Cleveland sports. They weren't really bragging because they were sitting there in the early second half thinking, okay, we were up by 4 TDs. Now we're up by 14, and the Steelers have all kinds of momentum, and Ben has his swag back. And like's happened this year, Ben has sucked in the first half and then played really well in the second half. I don't know why he needs to have to get going, but that was all occurring. Juju was going to the camera. It was momentum, whether it's real or fake or you believe in it or not. Momentum was on the Steelers' side for a certain point early fourth quarter. And what lost momentum? Tomlin punted the football. Right then, when the Steelers had momentum, after the horrible punt when you're down 20-0, as bad as that was and how you should never do that, it wouldn't have mattered if they would have scored there or at least kept momentum going there, because no one was talking about that anymore. But then you punt on a fourth and really short. It was barely a 4th and 1 with all momentum. Your offense is clicking. You're moving the football. You just scored on back-to-back TDs. Your defense, in terms of the Browns, were starting to have their head down and have doubt on the sideline. And then the second the Steelers punted, even before the Browns scored, you saw Baker pick his helmet up off the ground, put it on, and was that let's go. it was almost like someone slapped them in the face and got them ready again, because it appeared the Steelers knew they weren't going to win this, or they were terrified to have their defense out there, or I don't know what it was. This is a defense that set a record. You shouldn't be scared. So those were egregious calls that, as much as I've defended Tomlin and Ben more than maybe anybody else in Pittsburgh media over the years, and what I've said is true, I don't know how you live down those two decisions. Certainly the second one, that's worse. 4th and 1, fourth quarter, you're down by multiple scores to your rival. It's an underdog that has half their players out because of a global pandemic, and you punt the football. I'm sorry. That's just really, really bad. I don't care what he says. It's going to be asked. I don't care what he says. It's never going to be a good decision. And it is one of the worst decisions of his career. It's not too much to say that. And it will be a stain, because even if you lose to the Bills next round, winning this one playoff game is certainly better than getting embarrassed and making horrendous decisions in this game.
They should have won the game in a lot of ways coming in, but obviously the way the game played out, they shouldn't have won the game. But these decisions could have maybe turned it. Maybe they could have stolen one. I know there were no fans there to speak of, friends and family only in attendance at Heinz this week.
I think the fans would have left after the first half.
They might have. I mean, geez. I don't care how much you love somebody. Maybe it's just time to pull the plug and get out of the stadium at least, and watch. A lot of people need to learn that tailgate. Yes.
But
maybe that helped the Browns a little bit, not having the full-throated Steelers nation waving terrible towels, and you know how it goes. When you're trying to come back, that's often the loudest a crowd ever gets, is an epic comeback, like the Browns of 2002-03 found out very well.
Right.
Well, which you alluded to. But yeah, just one last thing on the punt decisions, on the 2-point decisions too. Once they went for 2 when they shouldn't have, and once they didn't win or did not when they should. It's hard to keep track of, but it's frustrating for me because those should be the easy parts of coaching. I put easy in quotes. Yeah. Everything goes a little faster when you're on the field. But for a couch jockey like myself to be able to tell you, yeah, that's what you should be able to do, that should be doable. The other stuff, motivating the team, putting together schemes, I can't do that stuff, but I could tell you when to punt for the most part. Spoiler, it's not often. And I could tell you when to go for 2 or when not to go for 2. That's the stuff that you can just do the math on ahead of time, have it ready to go.
I have a question
that's what really ticks me off just watching it at home. So that's why I get really passionate about that, because I can understand making mistakes in the more nebulous, complex areas of coaching, but not that stuff. Not that it's cut and dried, but it's more cut and dried.
The punting was awful
than other decisions. Mike, what do you think about the Browns? I think they played well enough to take advantage, obviously, of some Steelers errors, and nowhere near the Steelers' best game. I don't know if it was the Browns' A game necessarily either. They're missing their head coach, Kevin Stefanski, who
I don't think
knows what he was doing at home during that one. But I think it was a pretty solid B for Browns, and B was good enough to give them the victory. Do I think they're going to give Kansas City a game in Arrowhead? I'm not certain I would bet on that. But hey, I know a lot of people from Cleveland. I know a lot of Browns fans. It reminds me of myself as a Pirates fan growing up and not knowing any kind of success. So I can commiserate, I can sympathize and empathize with that. Sure. So, good for the Browns, good for that fan base. I think Baker Mayfield's entertaining. I think the team is entertaining in general. Kind of a throwback with the run game they have. I think that's probably the end of the line for them in these playoffs, but it's definitely a building block to beat the Steelers. My goodness, how good must that feel in that locker room? Back-to-back weeks, they clinched the playoffs against the Steelers, then they knocked the Steelers out of the playoffs 7 days later. It's never been a better time to be a Browns fan. You could argue that right now. Well, at least not for the current era. Going back to Otto Graham, sure. It was a better time to be a Browns fan back then.
I will tell you that as bad as this moment was for the Steelers, and as bad as this game is for Pittsburgh fans, and it's one of the most embarrassing losses in Steelers history and certainly Pittsburgh sports history. It's a really, really bad moment. It's right up there with one of the best moments in Cleveland sports history. And I totally get for the most recent modern fan, aside from the 60s Cleveland Browns days and back in the 1940s for the Cleveland Indians, that the 2016 Cleveland Cavaliers team that ended the drought and won that first championship since 1964. I get it. The SWAT, the block, coming back from 3-1 down, beating the Warriors dynasty, doing it the way you did, LeBron coming home after leaving and the hatred that was against him and then now loving him. I get it. That's going to be the moment. That's going to be probably most of these Cleveland sports fans who are fans of all these teams are going to say that's maybe the greatest moment of their life outside of getting married, having a kid, or anything to that vein. I get it. I feel like this is runner-up, if not maybe even higher for some of those fans for number one reason. Cleveland is a Browns town. As much as they love the Indians and LeBron, if it wasn't for LeBron being from Akron, I don't know if they love the Cavs nearly as much. It's a Browns town. They love the Browns. It's a football town, very similar to Pittsburgh. It is just like Pittsburgh. As much as the Penguins have had success and people love the Pirates, even though many don't realize that, it's a Steeler town. It's football here in this region, and Cleveland loves it, and Cleveland fans love it and have stayed loyal, and they have admittedly been very, very jealous of the Steelers' success and bitter about it, really, from talking to a lot of Browns fans over the years that I also know. So I know several Browns fans that have said, and even said back in 2016 when LeBron did it, that I would trade this ring for the Browns to win a Super Bowl. Like, they want Browns success more than anything. And they don't have a championship coming up, I don't believe. But to win this over Pittsburgh, dominating fashion after everything they dealt with, also get back-to-back wins to get in the playoffs over Pittsburgh, even with the Steelers not starting their varsity. Everything that happened in this game, the way they won it, it is one of the greatest moments for these Cleveland fans. And they get credit. I don't give them more than a B grade, though, because, again, Baker didn't play all that great. They also got really, really lucky on some turnovers. The Steelers played horrendous early on in this game. Horrendous is not even enough of a word. The Steelers get an F, if not a Z. I mean, that's how bad it was in the first half. So they certainly helped the Browns. The Steelers lost this more than Cleveland won, but Cleveland gets at least a B for the winning it in the moment, and they did play well enough with Chubb. But Chubb didn't even get 100 yards on the ground. So, again, it's not an A effort. This team has played better at times. A few weeks ago, they lose to the Jets. Last week, they almost lost to the Steelers with their JV. They do dominate this game. But this is a Browns team that has had their hiccups this year and barely beat Jacksonville. They haven't been great either. So that's why many thought the Steelers would pick it up and win this game. They certainly do not. My question, though, I want to go back to you, Matt, real quick on our last segment. As much as we can talk about Tomlin's career all day and whether or not he's back, we both, I'm sure, agree he's going to be back. So say Tomlin's going to be back and maybe one of these coordinators are gone, regardless of the roster. Recent years, what's happened with Tomlin to appease maybe the fixing without having to fire him, he's been able to alleviate and be convinced to alleviate his timeout duties, his review duties. I mean, they got interns galore that are there for certain decisions. That is all they're getting paid for, and their salary is to do the timeouts for the review. Will he consider another intern / salary person to just be there for these decisions that you were bringing up of the fourth down or of these minute details? I mean, if he goes that route, it might be like he's really not doing the important decisions overall. But is that somewhere you go as a compromise? Do you maybe like a decision like that to bring somebody else on? I mean, it's more bureaucracy. You'd have to be having somebody else in the kitchen too. But that's what's happened over recent years. Every time Tomlin's had a playoff failure, they obviously don't want to fire him. So they bring in somebody that's borderline an intern to just be there for those minute decisions. Do you see that maybe being the solution here? Because they're not firing a division championship head coach, no matter maybe if the era should finally close out. They're just not going to do it.
No, I don't think that does anything. Number one, I don't think they'll do it. I don't think it does anything because the ultimate decision still goes through the head coach's headset, right? Even Mike Vrabel, some of these new age progressive coaches, when it comes to analytics and making decisions based on data, they still have the final call. And even Vrabel, you could argue, screwed up in his game against the Ravens earlier today when it came down to a situational type of a play. So I don't think that would necessarily fix the situation. It might lend some more insight. You could have someone, it doesn't have to be an intern.
Then it's like you're just a motivational speaker too. Then I feel like then you're losing the head coaching credit.
Yeah, yeah. I really have a hard time believing any NFL head coach would give up that final call. Right? It just has to come through him. So that's just the way it's going to be. Now, could you talk to him before and after games and throughout summer camp in Latrobe? Just get some of those nuggets in his mind. Yes, you could definitely do that. And I know the Steelers have a pretty robust analytics department, all things considered. It's not the biggest in the league, but it's not the smallest either. So these people know this. They have to be tearing their hair out. Talk about me tearing my hair out. What about them? Because they're in the office with Mike every day. And maybe they've told him this stuff. I don't know. I'm not privy to those conversations, obviously.
No, and neither am I, despite a credential. But I will also say, to the Browns' credit, going back to the Browns, you mentioned analytics, and that being maybe the downfall of the Steelers in these recent playoff woes, some analytic poor decisions and some certain poor decisions in critical moments that could cost you, certainly in close games or really just games in general. The one thing the Browns probably don't get enough credit for, because it did not lead to success until this year, and maybe this year was ahead of schedule again, is several years ago, about 3 years ago, and to be fair, this was right around the time they didn't win a game at all. I mean, they were putrid. They decided to make their front office not football guys. They literally brought baseball guys in who could make analytic decisions, who maybe did not know who won the Super Bowl 10 years ago. I mean, these were not football guys. They were just making decisions analytically for building a roster and in-game analytic decisions from 3 years ago to now. And it clearly has worked out. And a lot of teams that have led dynasties have done it off analytics. Even the Patriots, for all Bill Belichick is a football guy, they have analytic guys in that house that do have influence on certain things. So I'm not saying Tomlin would ever do that. I don't believe it either. But at some point, even if you look at Greg Popovich with the Spurs and different coaches that have been able to have tons of success over a long period of time, they have at some point been mature to relinquish a little control to analytic guys, even if it means they get less credit for the win. And the Browns are a franchise that have done that more than really any other NFL team, even though it hasn't led to success until now. So maybe it's time we actually mention it and they get the credit for it, even though they have a young group who doesn't really have a resume before now. But they've done it off analytics. It's worked out. I do believe they're a year ahead of schedule. I do believe they could all of a sudden not make the playoffs next year. They certainly got to play better to get back in there next year. And the Steelers and Ravens and maybe even the Bengals will be better next year. They're still going to be contenders next year. But this moment will last a while for the Browns. It's a big deal for them. And I'll tell you right now, it's funny to say this when you have your head coach on the couch, but the Browns out-coached Mike Tomlin, a Hall of Famer, and their head coach wasn't even there. So that got to go to something in terms of personnel of the overall staff, because when you have a head coach not there and the backup can coach the lights out over a Hall of Famer, it's because he has influence in those meetings throughout the season. There's nobody really like that for the Steelers besides these coordinators that he would never give the keys to. So maybe that's whenever Tomlin's era is over, maybe if you're not going to do it with Mike T, maybe that's how you build to the future. Maybe you do copy the Browns a little bit, even though you shouldn't have to because you're the mighty Steelers. Maybe it is a younger coach, like when you hired Tomlin 15 plus years ago, and you allow people to have more decision-making control around him. One guy we brought up a lot on shows early in the season that has basically been non-existent in the witness protection program the second half of the year that I thought was brought in there to be this guy that would have influence regardless of position was Matt Canada. He has done basically nothing since week 10, despite continuing to collect the check. Why has that been? Why not hear more from him? Why not get more of those plays in? Even the great packages for Josh Dobbs last week, which a little bit more of Matt Canada than recent weeks. An hour before game time, Josh Dobbs inactive. Can't even hold a clipboard. Why? Why go away from things if they do work before they aren't working? It might not have made a difference in this game. When you're down 28-0, nothing Josh Dobbs is going to do with a package is going to fix it. But still, I don't get it. I don't get some of these decisions. It almost seems like you're making decisions before they need to be made, or if it's not broke, why are you fixing it? Or even Spillane starting was a conversation that many didn't like with Dobson. Maybe many thought Dotson should be starting this game because he had been playing better, but they do have that veteran mentality that we got to give it to the guy because he's been there a while and you want to have the playoff moment and he has to have this and that. And that mentality, I think, did bite him in the you-know-where this season and led to the most embarrassing loss in franchise history.
I think Josh Dobbs could have done a better job of being an X factor than Derek Watt getting 2 carries in the first quarter. Talk about
you can't get over that. I know.
I talk about overthinking it. Wow, my goodness, the guy gets nothing all year, and then 2 carries in the first quarter when it's at its highest leverage point. The game, it was still within reach.
JJ was surprised. JJ Watt was surprised. If you looked at his tweets, he was even surprised.
It's been 5 years since Paul DePodesta, the former assistant general manager of the Oakland A's, came over to the Cleveland Browns. He's now the Browns, let me look up the official title, Chief Strategy Officer and de facto president, at least according to Wikipedia there. But DePodesta, one of the brains behind the operation of the Oakland A's, of course, one of the stars of Moneyball. It's the Jonah Hill character. It was a hybrid character, but that's essentially who he was playing in the movie, if you're familiar with Moneyball.
My favorite character of the film, by the way.
Yeah, nothing like Paul DePodesta, apparently, who was, I think, offended that at that time a heavy-set Jonah Hill played a very thin Paul DePodesta, but neither here nor there. Like I said, it was a hybrid character. It was a composite type of thing. But that's the Browns obviously tore it all down. They had a couple of false starts there. It seems like they got it right with the head coach now with Kevin Stefanski, which is such a huge position, clearly.
Well,
and it seems
they
like
fire the head coach every year before, so
upstairs. Yeah, it's looking pretty good in Brownstown as of right now. But enough about the boys in orange. One last thing, the last thing I have, Mike, and I'll let you decide how long you want to go with this, but Juju Smith-Schuster probably played his last game for the Steelers tonight. Hey, it was a hell of a way to go out in the box score. 13 receptions for 157 yards. It was his first time over 100 yards all season. He had been Mr. Dink and Dunk, Mr. 5-yard slant and 8-yard out this year. But what he averaged, 12 per reception tonight. He had a long of 33, targeted 19 times, caught 13 of them, like I said, including a touchdown. I'll remember Juju mostly positively. I think he almost to a fault did his job on the field, and I think he's a tough wide receiver. I think those comparisons earlier this season to Heinz Ward were a little premature, but appropriate in their playing style. But there's just a little too much off the field, and I feel like he didn't check out mentally, but he started becoming pretty careless and I think selfish in a lot of ways off the field. I wonder if that caused any kind of discord within the locker room there. I suppose we'll never really know, at least not in the immediate future. So that takes away from his tenure. But overall, I was entertained by number 19 in his time in Pittsburgh. It ended up being 4 seasons. And I think this year might have been his finest year as a Steeler. Hard to argue otherwise in some ways. He was the leader of that receiving corps, and I think he did a pretty good job. I'll say that much.
I'll say I will remember Juju Smith-Schuster for a couple things. I will remember him as somebody that certainly overachieved in one sense, because when he was drafted by the Steelers, they already had Antonio Brown. Antonio Brown was the best receiver in all of football. That was prior to Steeler fans hating him and certainly feeling bitter for the way that fallout ended. Antonio Brown was in the height of his prime as the best receiver in football when they draft Juju. And Juju right away had one of the greatest rookie seasons ever as the number 2. But it was a year compared to Randy Moss. He was fitting in perfectly and was that Robin to AB's Batman. It appeared, really giving that extra dimension to the Steelers offense. He was great and maybe even overachieved reasonable expectations early on. I'll also remember Juju for, and this is something that's just said by anybody, Matt, that's the age of Juju. It might not be fair or unfair to say this, but it's just true, and it's been very, very evident with Juju during his 4 years with the Steelers that he's immature. There's immaturity there. I think the issue of him with the dancing and even some of his antics in general, I get that his social media is going to make more money for him and for his football life and post-football life and his life and for his kids than ever he'll have to worry about getting hit all the time. So I get that. And I never would take away a man trying to make a buck. But I don't think he ever really understood the optics of things. I don't think that he ever understood even the differences that we heard a lot this weekend of the Ravens dancing on the Titans logo. And why is that different than Juju? Well, for me, the difference is the Ravens dance on the Titans logo after a game when they won again on an opponent's field, whereas Juju would dance prior to a game during a 3-game losing streak where he wasn't playing well. The optics of that didn't look good, and it forced Cam Hayward and other veterans to have to answer for him. I think that's the one thing that Juju never got. or AB didn't understand either before, maybe he learned from AB, that he never was like AB. I don't think Juju's a bad guy. I don't think he ever had any ill intentions. I think, as was said on the broadcast by Chris Collinsworth, a former NFL receiver, he's a fun-loving guy that I'm sure you love being around, and he did grow up a little bit as a Steeler. Certainly was a good member of the team, but there was some immaturity there, and I think he never understood, because this is one thing that athletes don't like about other athletes. When I am an athlete on the team and I'm a veteran, and I have to answer for you constantly, week after week, I'm a little upset about it. I'm not saying that Cam Hayward secretly, when they're having a beer in the offseason, Matt, I'm sure he's laughing and saying, I didn't care if you dance, you're playing well on the field, no big deal. What I did care about is you continuously did something intentionally every week, and it was intentional. He would put in the TikTok, I'm doing this. You didn't want me to dance, so I'm going to dance here. Oh, you're going to make my teammate answer for it. Oh, well, they don't care. I think they do, because I was in those Zooms. I don't think they loved it. I don't think Tomlin loved it. I don't think Ben loved it. I don't think Cam loved it. I don't think TJ, even close to his age, loved it. I don't think they loved every Zoom that they had to hear. Did you talk to Juju? What's Juju's thought? Juju won't talk to us. What about Juju? And it could have quieted out by him. He could have just basically said, look, it's my personal career. You can't tell me to stop. But what I'm going to do is, I'm not playing well. We're not playing well. So I'm going to dance all night when we win. But I'll calm it down to help my teammates out, because they don't. Cam Hayward said, I didn't like it. I thought it was a little disrespectful when we weren't winning. Cam Hayward's not a guy that lies. So he then danced again the week after that, after Cam said that. That looks like a slap in the face to a 12-year-old veteran on the team. He's not a bad guy. He's not trying to make you a bad guy. But he basically said, bro, we're done with the dancing until we win again. And Juju responded by saying, no, I don't care. I'm going to dance anyway. That comes off like a 22-year-old who doesn't want to answer to authority or to a veteran on the team and just wants to do his own thing, knowing a lot of his fans will love him anyway. So that's immature. I also do think, Matt, to be fair about the on-field play, because we don't want to, Juju, again, he's not like AB. I don't think that's the story, even though his off-the-field will certainly be part of it. I think his immature antics will be part of it. But his on-the-field play, to me, he's a guy you'd want in the locker room. On the field, he's certainly a gamer, certainly like Heinz Ward in that way, certainly a physical receiver more than I would have thought. I think he's become more of a physical receiver. He had a good year. I don't think it was a great year. I know he was top 10 in catches and all that and almost had 100, but his yards after the catch was minuscule. And really, a receiver's work a lot of the time is yards after the catch, when you catch it and make something of it. He couldn't make anything of it most of this year prior to today. So it was an okay year. I think he's a good receiver. I don't think he's an elite receiver, which is what he thought he was coming into this year. Him and his agent did say, we are looking to become an elite receiver this year. I don't think he accomplished that, to be honest with you. I think what Juju's going to have against him, and what any team will say to him in a contract negotiation, you're great with another receiver there who's elite. When AB took the double coverage, Juju could get separation, be wide open. His numbers were fantastic. Once AB was gone and Juju got the double coverage, Juju's numbers would decrease. He didn't have even the best day in terms of separation last year. That was Deontay. It was better this year. But Juju's a better number 2 than a number 1 for me on the field, unless he improves a little bit in terms of separation. And I do think for somebody to give him $100 million for 5 or more years as a receiver, when the position continuously moves and you can draft, he is going to need to be more mature. I don't think even the biggest Juju lover can tell me he's the most mature player in the world. I get he's young, but when we're talking about $100+ million, Matt, you got to bring a maturity into that locker room more than just getting it done on the field. And he's good enough, not great for me, not a number 1 for me, not elite for me. But I also don't think he's mature enough for me to give him $100 million when I just drafted the best rookie in the franchise history a year ago. And I feel like I can do it again.
Yeah, I don't think he's back. I think it's appropriate that he killed it on the field in this game, all things considered.
Right.
And yet it's the off-field thing we'll be left remembering. those nameless gray faces of the Cleveland Browns. Yes, the Browns is the Browns.
Yeah.
And the Browns were pretty damn good tonight in a
And
lot
was
of ways.
that
They were
necessary
certainly better than the
to say either?
Steelers. Those nameless gray faces were shining in the spotlight of NBC's Sunday Night Football. They beat the Steelers.
Yeah.
They eliminate the Steelers. First time we can say that in a long time. 48-37. The Browns get their first playoff win since Bill Belichick was coaching and Vinny Testaverde was throwing passes. Baker Mayfield wasn't even born for that game. But yeah, he's the next Cleveland Browns hero. Kevin Stefanski, I suppose a hero. He wasn't even there. What an odd year. Odd way to end it in a lot of ways for the Steelers. The opponent, the setting, nobody there. And also the fact they were 11-0 on Thanksgiving, and they end up losing 5 of their last 6, including this playoff embarrassment. No other way to put it. Mike, I had a blast doing these post games with you. I hope that all the fans, all the chatters liked it too. I saw the conversation was certainly rolling. I just mostly stayed out of it tonight, other than to moderate a couple of times. So thank you to all of our participators here, all the folks who were avid listeners and watchers of Pittsburgh postgame throughout the Steelers season. We're going to do this for the Penguins coming up, maybe even a show this week. So the Pens open up against Philadelphia on Wednesday. Looking forward to some hockey talk. And Mike, looking forward to just working with you more here on Pittsburgh Sports Live. So thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. This was that other extra little thing we needed to add here for Pittsburgh Sports Live. So despite a tough year with a pandemic and not even having games at all being played for months on end, we put a trivia show together. You definitely have fit here in at PSL, and these post-game shows made a lot of sense. I'm glad we're doing them. And obviously these Steelers post-game shows have been great for business, win or lose. So certainly we appreciate all the fans, subscribers. Look at all the numbers. Look at all the chatters. Look at some of the video. I mean, Juju, speaking on Juju, I got to say we'll miss him here at PSL if he's no longer around. He was putting up some 200,000 video numbers on some of those views. I don't think anyone else is going to really do that. The players who used to do that with your PSL coverage were Phil Kessel and Antonio Brown on some of my shows. Those guys are gone. So Juju leaves too, probably. So again, it was positive for us, which makes it positive for you guys. So we definitely appreciate it. I will say, and we're definitely going to have tons of coverage throughout the Now family of networks, of course. Still tons of coverage here, just because we're moving into Penguin season. There'll be post-game shows there. Certainly going to be post-game shows. I'm also going to do some post-game shows here myself, and the WV Sports Now team will gear up. Now, I told him once Steelers season was over, I'd get more over there with post-game shows for the Mountaineers basketball season. A lot of controversy, a lot of wins, some losses recently, but a top 15 team. Huggins looking at a Hall of Fame. So we got to cover it. They're doing it, and we're going to do post-game shows for them as well as for Pitt and etc. So it's going to all happen here. We definitely want you to subscribe. It makes sense. Bottom of the video, click that subscribe button there. It's free to do so. So it makes it easier for us to get our content to you. And I will say that there's going to be tons of coverage, though. With all that said, still, I'd imagine even after the way this season ended, the Steelers Now will continue and Steelers videos will continue to be our best coverage here throughout the Now family networks and on PSL, because it didn't end pretty. And there's tons to talk about with the offseason, whether or not these changes will happen, if they're going to happen, going into the draft, going into Indianapolis, whether that's going to happen or not at the Combine. A lot going on. Even Kevin Colbert's been in rumors. Maybe the way this ends, he wants to go elsewhere. Quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if he retires. I'd actually know his daughter personally, and conversations have been had about that a couple years ago. So that wouldn't shock me. Tons could be changed in this offseason. A lot of that will happen over at SteelersNow.com. And I guess I'll leave you with this. We said weeks ago that when you're 11-0, regardless of how you're playing, regardless of what's happening, because nobody's playing perfect this year and because of the pandemic, that it was championship or bust, or at least championship or game or bust. We then amended that it would be at least playoff victory, at least get one win or bust once you still got the 3 seed, despite kind of closing the chapter very, very poorly at the end of the year. They don't get that. They don't get the playoff win. They lose that first playoff game. They lose it at home. It is the most embarrassing loss in Steelers playoff history. I'm serious when I say it. It's not just trying to be funny or be a personality. I really, really think it is. It was bad all the way around. It was worse than it could have ever been for many of these individuals. Tons of things will change in the offseason. Tons of question marks are there. And the way they lost makes this the case that it sucks to say this for a division champion that missed the playoffs the last 2 years, that had to overcome tons this year. I get it. And again, I said before, Tomlin and Ben are still Hall of Famers. but they had a bad few months to end the season. They had a really, really bad playoff game against the Browns and an embarrassing loss. And the overall grade for me on this year is a C+, and I was tempted to go C-. When you look at the expectations, the overall year, the way it ends, and the conversation that I'm going to have to talk about, that we're going to have to cover and that you're going to see tons of, not for us wanting to do that, but because of what they're providing us as their work, it can't be any higher than that. I mean, this was a disappointing year. These players are crying. They're saying it's underachieving. They know it was. The perception's going to be bad. I don't see how anybody goes above that. And that's weird to say for a 12-4 division champion. They're probably the only 12-4 division champion to get a lower than a B grade in any year. But that's the case when you start 11-0. You end this way, and it's this embarrassing as we close. But again, thanks to everybody who's been around that stuck with us through a trying year. And we have tons more coverage throughout the Now family of networks, and certainly that means more coverage here on PSL.
I'll let Mike Tomlin have the final word instead of me. Here's what he said after the game on Zoom. We were a group that died on the vine. I think that sums it up, doesn't it? The man does have a way with words, even if he doesn't have a way with punt decisions. Or
I will miss the wordsmith in him, yes.
Et cetera, et cetera. So we'll end with that. Died on the vine. I can't sum it up any better. Also, go to SteelersNow.com to see Alan Saunders' writing, Ed Thompson's photos, some great work from them, I'm sure, from Heinz Field tonight. And what's the final night of the Steelers 2020-2021 COVID-19 season? Yeah, COVID-19 is going to be the name and number we remember the most, I think, when we look back on this one. For Mike, I'm Matt. This has been Pittsburgh Postgame. We'll talk to you next time on Pittsburgh Sports Live.